The desert sky had turned a cruel shade of red when the boy was dragged into the town square. He was no more than an orphan, a child with nothing to his name but the rags on his back and the dust beneath his feet. Yet the townsfolk gathered as if justice itself were being served. A crime had been committed, cattle stolen from the wealthiest rancher in the territory, and someone had to pay. With no family to defend him and no voice strong enough to plead his case, the orphan became the perfect scapegoat. The whip cracked against his skin, each lash a lie carved into flesh. He screamed, not only from pain, but from the helplessness of knowing that no one believed his innocence. The faces around him were cold, some indifferent, others satisfied, as though his suffering balanced scales that had never truly been tipped by his hands. In the West, justice was often swift, but rarely fair, and that night, it was twisted into a spectacle. When they finally left him broken in the dirt, the crowd dispersed, satisfied that order had been restored. But beneath the boy's blood and bruises burned something far stronger than despair. His tears dried into dust, his body trembled with rage, and in the hollow silence of the night, he whispered a vow to the stars. He would not die as the orphan who carried another man's crime. He would rise, and he would carve truth into the very hearts of the guilty. The wind howled through the empty streets as he staggered to his feet, each step heavier than the last, yet fueled by something unyielding. He was no longer just a boy beaten by injustice. He was a soul reborn in fire. His body bore the marks of punishment, but his heart carried the weight of promise. For in the Wild West, vengeance was a language understood by all, and he had just begun to learn its words. By the time the moon reached its highest point, the orphan's eyes no longer held the innocence of childhood. They gleamed with resolve, with the sharpness of a blade hidden in plain sight. That night, as the town slept unaware of the storm they had created, a new story was etched into the dust. And it began with a vow whispered in blood. He would bring ruin not with the whip of his accusers, but with the justice of his own hand. The boy limped into the darkness beyond the town's edge, his back burning with every movement, but his spirit too raw to collapse. The desert wind bit against his wounds, yet he welcomed the sting, for it reminded him that he was still alive. Each lash of the whip replayed in his mind like a ghost, not only the pain but the faces of those who had condemned him. He remembered the sneer of the rancher whose cattle had been stolen, the silence of the sheriff who knew better, and the eyes of townsfolk who had turned away. They had branded him guilty not because of evidence, but because he was weak and alone. That night, the orphan found shelter beneath the crumbling remains of an abandoned barn. The stars stretched endless above him, cold and distant, but he stared at them as if they were witnesses to his vow. His hands shook, his breath came ragged, but his words were steady as steel. He would uncover the true thief, and when he did, the guilty would know a punishment harsher than any whip. The West had taken everything from him, but it had given him one gift, the fire of revenge. He knew survival would not be easy. The town was built on power, where the wealthy commanded respect, and the poor bore the blame. If he returned too soon, they would finish what they had begun. So, he resolved to disappear, to let them believe he had been broken. A boy beaten and forgotten was no threat. Yet while they carried on with their lives, he would sharpen his silence into a blade. The following days blurred into hardship. He scavenged scraps, drank from shallow creeks, and nursed his wounds with grit and fury. Each scar became a reminder, each pang of hunger a lesson. The West taught its orphans to endure, and he endured not out of hope, but out of promise. The faces of the guilty never left his mind. He carried them like ghosts on his shoulders, their names carved deeper than his wounds. By the end of the week, he was no longer the broken child who had collapsed in the dirt. He was something harder, something forged in the cruelty of others. His vow had rooted itself into his bones, and though he had nothing, he carried within him the most dangerous weapon of all, patience. As the months passed, the orphan vanished from memory, but not from the land. Rumors spread of a boy who wandered the plains, working odd jobs for cattlemen, fixing fences, breaking horses, learning the trades of men who never saw him as a threat. He listened more than he spoke, watched more than he acted, and every secret he uncovered became a thread in the web he was weaving. To the world, He was just another nameless drifter. But beneath the surface, his vow sharpened with every passing day. The town where he had been whipped carried on, as though nothing had happened. The rancher flaunted his wealth, boasting of cattle herds that stretched across valleys, while the sheriff buried his guilt beneath silence and whiskey. The true thief, cloaked in the comfort of lies, walked freely, unchallenged. But whispers of unrest began to ripple, small herds disappearing in the night, fences cut, water poisoned. At first, they thought it was outlaws. But those who had watched the orphan's eyes on the day of his beating began to wonder if it was something else, or someone. The boy, now hardened into a young man, returned in secret one evening to the outskirts of the town. Cloaked by shadows, he walked the same square where his blood had stained the dirt. The sight of it stoked the fire in his chest, reminding him of the vow that had carried him through nights of hunger and cold. He was not here for reckless revenge, not yet. Justice, he knew, demanded precision, and precision demanded time. He began with whispers. Late at night, he left tokens on doorsteps, a strip of leather torn from a whip, a brand seared into wood, a warning carved into the dirt. Fear spread through the guilty like wildfire, for they remembered the orphan they had condemned, and the idea that he might still live gnawed at their pride. The townsfolk began to murmur of ghosts, of vengeance riding silently through the plains. But he was no ghost. He was flesh and blood, tempered by pain, sharpened by silence. And as the guilty lay restless in their beds, he stood just beyond their reach, watching, waiting. The West had taught him that revenge was not taken in haste. It was built like a fire, fed slowly, until the night came when the flames could no longer be contained. The young man's presence was like smoke on the horizon, unseen, yet felt. He took work at neighboring ranches, never staying too long, but long enough to learn. He studied the habits of cattle thieves, the trails they favored, the brands they altered, and the lies they whispered in saloons after too much whiskey. He pieced together a puzzle the town had long chosen to ignore, and slowly, the shape of the true criminal emerged. It was not a drifter, not a nameless outlaw, but a man seated close to power, shielded by wealth and respect. This revelation struck him harder than the whip ever had. The guilty man, the one who had condemned him without hesitation, was not the rancher who had lost the cattle, but a rival ranch hand, trusted, praised, and protected. He had orchestrated the thefts, then pointed his finger at the boy who had no one to defend him. Rage boiled in his chest, but he swallowed it, for vengeance could not be wasted in haste. To punish him properly, he would have to strip away the lies, piece by piece, until the town itself saw the truth. Nights turned into weeks as he shadowed the guilty man, learning his routines, watching his arrogance fester. He moved like a phantom, always a step behind, marking every secret path, every hidden deal, every weak link. He left no sign of himself, but his vow grew heavier with every discovery. He no longer dreamed of survival. He dreamed of the night when the guilty man's pride would collapse in the same dirt where his own blood had been spilled. Yet the orphan's revenge was not only for himself. In the saloons, he overheard whispers of other innocents framed, other lives broken under false accusations. The West thrived on silence, but silence left graves unmarked and stories untold. He realized his vow was larger now. It was not just about his scars, but about every soul crushed by the powerful who thought they could bend justice. His vengeance was no longer a wound. It was a mission. And so, with the patience of a hunter, he set his trap. The guilty man would not fall by a bullet in the dark, but by the slow, merciless unveiling of truth. For in the West, reputation was as sharp as any blade, and when stripped away, it left a man more broken than any lash could. The young man chose his moment carefully. It was at the cattle auction, when the entire town gathered to trade, boast, and drink under the open sky. The ranchers sat proud, the sheriff kept his uneasy watch, and the guilty man strutted among them as if he owned the dust beneath his boots. It was here, in front of every eye that had once looked away from the boy's suffering, that vengeance would begin to unfold. From the shadows, the orphan stepped forward, no longer a boy, but a figure hardened by time and fire. His scars were hidden beneath his shirt, but his eyes carried them openly. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some recognized him. Others thought him a ghost. The sheriff froze, his drink slipping from his hand, for he knew the boy had survived. And worse, he knew the boy had returned with something more dangerous than anger: purpose. The young man spoke not with rage, but with a voice sharpened by years of silence. He told the crowd of the thefts, of the trails he had followed, of the lies whispered when no one thought to listen. He named the guilty man, his words falling heavy in the dust. Laughter erupted at first, but then he produced evidence: cattle brands altered by a clumsy hand, contracts forged in haste, a witness too fearful until now to speak. The murmurs turned to gasps, the laughter to unease. The guilty man sputtered, his arrogance cracking as the crowd pressed closer. He shouted denial, but the weight of proof crushed his voice. The sheriff, cornered by the truth he could no longer ignore, stepped forward reluctantly, his badge gleaming under the sun. And in that moment, the young man felt the first taste of justice, not for himself alone, but for every lash, every scar, every night of exile. Yet vengeance was not complete. To expose the guilty was one thing. To make him feel the same helplessness, the same isolation, was another. The young man's vow had never been about blood alone. It had been about balance. And as the crowd turned on the man who had once stood untouchable, the orphan knew that balance was finally within reach. The guilty man was dragged into the center of the square, the same ground where the orphan had once been whipped for a crime he never committed. The irony was not lost on the young man. The dust beneath their feet carried memories of his own blood, and now it would carry the downfall of the one who had put him there. The crowd swelled, torn between shock and vindication, their whispers cutting sharper than any blade. In the West, reputation was everything, and once broken, it was near impossible to mend. The sheriff, pale and hesitant, announced that the man would stand trial. But the townsfolk were restless, their faith in the law already fragile. Some demanded immediate justice, recalling how swiftly the orphan had been condemned with no proof, while this man had lived years in comfort and deceit. The young man stood silent, his eyes fixed on the trembling figure before him, knowing that fate itself was shifting. Justice, long delayed, was now bleeding into vengeance. As the guilty man pleaded, his words fell flat against the evidence. The branded cattle, the forged contracts, the witnesses too frightened until now. All of it painted him into a corner from which there was no escape. His arrogance, once unshakable, crumbled before the eyes of those who had once admired him. He was no longer the respected ranch hand, but a thief unmasked in front of the very people he had deceived. The young man did not strike him, nor did he raise his hand in violence. He simply stood, watching, as the crowd that had once condemned him now turned their judgment upon another. It was not the whip that broke the guilty man. It was the weight of exposure, the crushing realization that the town no longer belonged to him, that his name was now filth in the dust. For the orphan, now grown, this moment was more than personal victory. It was proof that truth, though buried, could rise again. He felt the fire of his vow cool into something steadier, something sharper. Revenge had carried him this far, but justice was what would carry him further. And in that realization, he understood that his story had become bigger than himself. But justice in the West was never clean. The guilty man, stripped of respect, still had allies, men loyal to coin more than truth, men who owed him favors carved in blood. That night, as the town slept, shadows moved through the alleys, whispers of revenge brewing in silence. The young man, though victorious in daylight, knew his enemies would not surrender so easily. The West had taught him well. Truth could shake men, but power would always strike back. He slept lightly, his ears tuned to every creak of the floorboards in the shack where he now stayed. And just before dawn, the sound he dreaded came: boots in the dirt, low voices plotting in the dark. The guilty man's allies had come to finish what their master could not. They had failed to break him once with a whip, but now they would try with bullets. The young man slipped into the night, his body moving with the quiet precision he had learned from years of survival. The shadows pursued him through the outskirts, rifles glinting under the pale moon. But unlike the boy they had once cornered, this was no helpless orphan. This was a man sharpened by scars, a figure who had turned silence into a weapon. And in the stillness of the desert, he set his trap. Shots cracked through the night, echoing off canyon walls, but each bullet found only empty dust. The young man moved like smoke, leading them deeper into the wilderness, where the land itself became his ally. One by one, their resolve faltered, their courage thinning as they realized they were chasing a ghost they had created. The hunter was no longer them. It was him. By the time dawn broke, the young man returned to the town alone, his face shadowed but unbroken. The guilty man's allies had been scattered, their loyalty crumbling with the same ease as their master's pride. And as the first light touched the town square, the orphan who had once been whipped stood tall, no longer haunted by the past, but carrying the weight of his vow fulfilled. His enemies had tried to silence him, but the West itself had chosen otherwise. The town woke to find the young man, standing in the square where his story had begun. The morning sun lit his figure like a brand upon the land, and whispers spread faster than the smoke curling from chimneys. To some, he was the orphan who had returned from the dead. To others, he was a warning that truth, once buried, always clawed its way back. The sheriff, shaken but cautious, approached him, demanding to know what had happened in the desert. The young man answered only with silence, his eyes carrying the weight of things no law could ever record. The guilty man, now locked in a cell, pressed his face against the bars as the young man passed. Gone was the arrogance, the sneer, the easy laugh that had condemned an innocent. In its place was desperation, the frantic gaze of a man who knew his world had crumbled. "You'll regret this," he spat, his voice cracking. "You think they'll honor you, but this town has no loyalty." The words carried truth and poison alike, but the young man did not flinch. He knew the West owed loyalty to no one. Respect had to be forged, just like steel on the anvil. The people began to gather around him, their eyes uncertain, some filled with shame for the night they had let him suffer, others filled with admiration for the strength that had carried him back. He did not raise his voice to accuse them, nor did he call for vengeance upon the whole town. Instead, he let the silence speak, a silence that reminded them of every lash they had watched without protest. And in that silence, the weight of guilt shifted from his shoulders to theirs. That evening, a fire was lit in the center of the square, and the townsfolk spoke of what had been hidden for too long. The truth of the thefts, the corruption of the sheriff, the lies of the rancher who had covered his own pride with blood. The young man listened, his face calm, knowing that the story was no longer his alone. The people had taken it into their own voices, and once the West gave breath to a story, it could never again be silenced. And as the flames burned against the night sky, the orphan felt the scars on his back ache less. They would never vanish, but they no longer chained him. He had kept his vow. He had uncovered the guilty. And now, in the very town that once tried to erase him, his presence was a reminder that even the smallest, most voiceless soul could rise and bend the world to truth. But legends are not born in peace. They are tempered in fire. Though the guilty man had been unmasked, the land itself remained tainted by years of silence. The rancher still held wealth, the sheriff still clung to his badge, and the orphan knew that men like them would not surrender easily. Their power was not in truth, but in fear, and fear was a weapon they would wield until someone pried it from their hands. One night, as the desert wind howled through the town, a group of ranch hands loyal to the old order gathered in the saloon. Their voices were thick with anger and whiskey, their fists pounding on the wooden tables. They spoke of restoring pride, of silencing the boy before his name grew too loud. They were men who could not bear to see the balance of power shift, men who believed the West belonged only to those with land and coin. And in their rage, they plotted his downfall. The young man knew of their whispers before dawn. He had learned to live by listening, by reading the spaces between words, by watching shadows stretch longer than men realized. He did not run. He did not hide. Instead, he stood at the edge of the town, waiting, the moonlight painting his silhouette against the dust. He understood now that revenge had carried him far, but justice demanded more than survival. It demanded confrontation. When the men came, rifles on their shoulders and hate in their eyes, They found not a boy to be broken, but a figure unmoved by fear. He spoke no threats, raised no weapon. He let them see the scars on his back, the proof of their silence, the living memory of injustice they could not erase. And for a moment, even the boldest of them faltered, for they realized that bullets could kill a man, but not a truth already burned into the land. The standoff ended not with gunfire, but with retreat. One by one, the men lowered their weapons, their courage dissolving under the weight of what stood before them. The young man did not smile, did not gloat. He simply turned away, his vow fulfilled, his enemies scattered. For in that moment, the orphan ceased to be only a man. He became a story. And stories, in the Wild West, outlived guns, gold, and even time itself. Days passed, and the town could no longer look at the orphan, now a man, without remembering the night of his suffering. Children whispered his name with awe, women watched him with sorrow, and men shifted uncomfortably beneath his gaze. He had become more than flesh. He was a living reminder of their silence, their failure to stand against injustice. The sheriff, once the enforcer of law, now walked with bowed shoulders, his badge gleaming but his authority hollow. The rancher spoke less, his voice stripped of pride, for every word reminded the people of the boy they had once condemned. Yet, the young man carried no crown of victory. He lived simply, taking work when it was offered, sleeping under open skies, his heart too restless to settle. Revenge had been the fire that guided him, but now that the flames had cooled, he stood at a crossroads. He had torn away lies, he had broken the guilty, but what did one do when vengeance was complete? The West did not pause for answers, it demanded choices. Some in the town urged him to stay, to rebuild what had been broken, to claim a place among them. They wanted him as proof that they could change, as a shield against the corruption that still lingered in their soil. But he felt the pull of the horizon stronger than their pleas. For while his scars had been born here, his destiny stretched beyond these fences. The truth he carried was not meant to stay buried in one town. It belonged to the dust, the wind, and the roads yet unwritten. One evening, he returned to the square, the same place where the whip had first kissed his back. He stood in silence as the townsfolk gathered, waiting for words. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, calm, but heavy with meaning. He told them he had forgiven none, but neither would he strike them again. Their guilt was theirs to bear, their silence theirs to confront. He was not their savior. He was only their reminder. As the sun sank behind the desert hills, he mounted his horse. The crowd parted without a word, their eyes following him, as if watching a ghost fade into the horizon. He left them not with promises, but with truth, the kind that lingers like a wound and heals only with time. And with each hoofbeat that carried him farther, the legend of the orphan grew larger than the man himself. The trail stretched endless before him, but he rode it with a calm resolve. He was no longer the boy who had stumbled beneath lashes, nor the youth consumed by vengeance. He was a man carved by the land, by betrayal, by fire and silence. His story was not about the scars on his back, but about the choice he made arise when the world demanded he fall. And though he rode alone, the West rode with him. Every canyon, every star, every whisper of the wind carrying the echo of his vow. In distant saloons, his name began to drift across poker tables and whiskey glasses. Some said he was a ghost. Others swore they had seen him under the moon, riding like a shadow. Mothers warned their children never to raise a false hand against the weak, for the orphan's story lived in every crack of a whip, in every lie told under the sun. He had become a legend, not because of vengeance, but because he proved that truth could not be buried forever. The young man carried no map, no riches, no family name. Yet, he carried something far greater, a story etched into the very soil of the frontier. Wherever injustice lived, his presence was felt, whether in flesh or in whispers. The guilty feared him, the broken drew strength from him, and the land itself seemed to honor him with silence when he passed. The orphan had become more than a victim or even a victor. He had become a force. But deep within, he carried one last truth. Vengeance may set a fire, but only justice can keep it burning. He had avenged himself, yes, but the true weight of his journey was the lesson it carried. To remain silent in the face of cruelty was to become guilty as well. And that was a truth the West would never forget, for his story had carved it into the dust and into the hearts of all who listened. And so, he rode on, into the horizon where the sun bled into the earth, not as a boy, not as an orphan, but as a legend born of injustice, shaped by pain, and immortalized by truth. In the Wild West, where names faded like smoke, his would endure. The orphan who had once been broken, yet chose to rise, and in rising, reminded the world that even the weakest can change the course of destiny. The orphan's story did not end the night his vow was fulfilled. It began to live in every whisper that passed across the plains. He had been beaten, silenced, and marked as guilty when he was innocent. Yet he rose from the dust stronger than those who tried to destroy him. His scars became his testimony, not of weakness, but of resilience. And in the end, his life became a reminder that truth, though buried under lies, will always rise when someone dares to carry it. What he left behind was not just fear in the hearts of the guilty, but a lesson etched into the conscience of all who witnessed his journey. He showed that silence is never neutral, that to look away when injustice reigns is to place the whip in the hand of the oppressor. His suffering revealed the cost of cowardice, but his courage revealed the power of one voice to shake even the strongest walls of deceit. The Wild West was a land of lawless men and fleeting justice, but his story carved a deeper law into the soil, the law of truth and perseverance. It taught that vengeance may begin with fire, but justice endures in the hearts it awakens. He carried no riches, no titles, no bloodline of honor, yet his name became greater than those who had tried to erase him. For legends are not built on wealth, but on the courage to rise when the world demands you stay broken. And so, the orphan became more than a boy, more than a man. He became a symbol, a warning to the corrupt, and a light to the voiceless. His vow was not only for himself, but for every forgotten soul whose cries were ignored. His legacy whispered across the desert winds that even the weakest, when armed with truth, could change the course of destiny. That is why his story endures, not as a tale of suffering, but as a beacon of defiance, resilience, and hope. If this journey struck you, let its echo continue. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let others feel the weight of this story by giving your support with a like. And keep these powerful tales alive by subscribing to the channel. Just as his voice refused to be silenced, your voice here ensures that stories like his will ride far beyond the horizon, carrying their lessons to every soul willing to listen.